prosecutors decided against retrying the couple. Joining us now to discuss the aftermath of this decision is Bob Gibson. He is the senior researcher at the Academy for Civil Renewal at the University of Virginia's Cooper Center for Public Service. He's former executive director of the Sorensen Institute at the University of Virginia. Bob Gibson, good to talk to you again.
Hi, Kojo. Good to join your show.
Bob joins us by phone. Bob, what was your first reaction when you heard the news about the decision not to try former Governor Bob McDonnell? Is this how you imagined it would go down?
I thought that's how it would end once the Supreme Court had overturned the conviction. There were people in both parties in Virginia who thought that the federal prosecution was sort of an unfair add-on to state laws that were so lax that he clearly hadn't violated any state law, and his violation of the federal statute seemed to be putting other politicians in jeopardy because many politicians take gifts and many do routine favors for the people who give them gifts.
From your position, did the justice system, quote-unquote, work for a state that prides itself on the Virginia way of doing politics? Do you think the public should be encouraged from what was announced last week?
Well, I think the public's reaction and the legislators' reaction has been fairly similar. There's been a great deal of sympathy for McDonnell, who was a likable 14-year delegate, attorney general, and governor. People on both sides of the aisle liked him. They didn't see him as an outlier. They saw him as somebody who accepted too many gifts, and they were too lavish, and it was tawdry looking, as the Supreme Court acknowledged. But they need to draw new lines to make it clearer what is in bounds and what is out of bounds.
We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you can join the conversation now by calling 800-433-8850. Should federal prosecutors have retried Governor Bob McDonnell, in your opinion? 800-433-8850. You can send email to kojo@wamu.org or shoot us a tweet at Kojo Show. Bob Gibson, is the Virginia way of doing politics still alive? What does that mean even now?
It's a funny name, isn't it? The Virginia way assumes that the state politics are cleaner than most other states, that the elected officials are more civic-minded, and that doesn't work as well in an era when the public doesn't trust politicians. And we clearly live in an area where the trust in politicians is ebbing and very low. It's meant few, if any, limits on gifts. It's meant few, if any, limits on the size of political contributions, and that is changing now, especially as our politics in Virginia is becoming more nationalized. We're becoming more like the rest of the nation, as our demographics and our population are more like the rest of the nation. So it's clear that new lines have to be drawn, and the legislature is a little slow in drawing those lines. They're very cautious about it and timid about it, really. But they are drawing lines, and the Virginia way is changing. We're becoming more like other states.
The Washington Post editorialized that another aspect of the Virginia way, in addition to the civility that it implies, is a certain complacency about public ethics and the laws necessary to enforce them. Was that the case, and is that changing?
Well, Virginia is not New Jersey, and we're not Maryland, and we're not Illinois, and we don't have the record of corruption that some other states have, which is perhaps why our laws are so lax. There hasn't been the emergency to respond to until this McDonnell case. I can recall only two instances in my 20-some years of covering the General Assembly in Richmond where state legislators were convicted of ethics violations. One was a state senator back in the late 1980s, Peter Babelis of Norfolk, who was censured. There was no penalty involved for a conflict of interest. And the other was Phil Hamilton, who was much more recent, the Newport News delegate, who sort of wrote in the budget enough money for him to have a job at Old Dominion University, which had agreed to hire him. And Phil Hamilton got 9.5 years, but that was a federal conviction. The McDonnell thing was a surprise because it was a federal conviction. There hadn't been any state law violation that anybody had pointed to. So Virginia way is changing because we're no longer the cleanest and seen as the cleanest.
Bob Gibson is the senior researcher at the